We interviewed almost exactly 5 years ago. This was COVID pandemic time, early days. And you were talking about what this exposed in our supply chains of components of medicines, the threat that existed there. And I was shocked. This was frankly unbelievable information to me that we could be so vulnerable here in the West to China using these supply chains. Has anything changed?
I remember when we met Jan, and it was as Washington and the country was shutting down. And we talked about China RX, and that's what exposed how dependent we are as a country on China for what we need to survive as a country during a pandemic. The United States depends on China for 95% of the key components that are necessary to make our generic drugs. And if China shut the door on exports within months, our healthcare system would begin to collapse. That's how dependent we are. And it's not just us. The world is dependent. Europe is dependent because China has a chokehold on those upstream raw materials and chemicals needed to make these active ingredients, which makes the medicine. And that turns into the pills and vials that we have and take.
And I recall that it's about 91% of the prescribed medicines in the US are actually these generics. So this is massive.
It's huge. And whatever hospital you're in, whether it's all the big name hospitals, what they use are generic drugs, and they're about 91% of what's administered and prescribed.
While this may be obvious to some of our viewers, why is this a problem?
Well, as China RX predicted a lot of what happened, that in the event of a natural disaster, global pandemic, or a geopolitical event, the United States will be waiting in line behind other countries to get vital medicines to save people's lives. We have lost our industrial base. And during the pandemic, we had rationing of vital medicines in this country. It wasn't called rationing. That would scare the public. The media didn't call it rationing. The euphemism used in the industry is, well, Dr. So-and-so, well, we won't be able to deliver those drugs to you today. They're, quote, on allocation, which means they're actually allocating whatever they have in certain priority areas. So we were rationing drugs in the United States.
And this is because what? And spell it out for me here. Well, this is why.
Because we have lost our industrial base to be able to make the medicines, 90% of our medicine supply. We can't make it anymore. We can't make antibiotics anymore in this country from beginning to end. We can't make penicillin. We can't make those antibiotics needed to treat sepsis, which can kill you. We can't make the antibiotics to treat pneumonia, sexually transmitted diseases. We offshored that. And that's a risk of huge, tremendous national security. And if I may say, while we were very focused on treating viral infections, what about bacterial infections? And during the pandemic in the early 1900s, what people died of was not viral infection, but bacterial infections. And they died because we didn't have antibiotics. And if you remember, back in March 2020, China said, well, if the US doesn't do what we want, we could withhold antibiotics from the United States. Think of that.
Well, I think, I remember when that happened, and I was thinking about our interview, right? Because this was basically the case in point.
Absolutely right. We have a system that is perfectly designed for catastrophic failure and significant loss of human life. And that has to change, and it's fixable. This is a man-made problem.
It strikes me there's basically two dimensions here of the problem, right? One is, where they're being made. So, we know a lot of them come from India, but we also know that a very significant portion of what's made in India, those components come from China. So it's really China.
China RX exposed that. And this was a big shock to me. We all think of India, which is a great generic powerhouse. But then you look more deeply, and during COVID pandemic, the Indian government actually came out and said that we depend, and our generic industry depends on China for 69% of the components it needs for its industry. I can't think of any other product, any other food commodity, whether it's wheat, rice, corn, or energy supplies, that we have allowed to be centralized in a single country, whatever country it is a disaster waiting to happen.
You're giving me a 95% number. Just explain to me how you got there.
Sure. Well, first off, we're talking about thousands of different raw materials and chemicals that are used to make our medicines, generic and branded drugs. And where I got the 95% figure from is from people who actually make medicines. They are pharmaceutical engineers, they are CEOs of companies. So I'll tell you a quick story. So in February of 2020, when a virus was coming from east to west and going to hit North America, I was having dinner with 5 extraordinary people who had a combined experience of 150 years in making medicine. So I asked them this question as the entree was being served. I said, so we're going to need generic medicines to take care of very sick people in intensive care units, or emergency rooms. What percentage of the components needed to make those medicines are sourced from China? And it was 90%, 95%, 90%, 95%, 95%, as we went around the table. So that's one data point from people who have to go source from distributors, and they in turn, this is their business, it's what they do. It's like you're a chef and you know where all your ingredients come from and who are the best sources and the country of origin often of where they're made, where they're produced. Another data point is a wonderfully respected leader in Europe who ran a company that supplied actually generics to our military. He said that it's about 98% of our generic drugs depend on some component from China. And another executive from Holland, now retired, he said, China owns that raw material market globally. And even the Europeans are concerned that what if they decide to withdraw that?
I'm talking about this first dimension, right, which is where, all of these things coming from China, hard to fathom that could have ever happened. After that threat of withholding during the COVID pandemic, what has changed? Have we been rushing to bring back those supply chains, repatriate them to America in the West, or, friendshore, as they call it, perhaps as well?
Overall, I think there's been very little change. Companies have habits of how they purchase, and they want to purchase the cheapest product. And we can talk more about this later and how that system works. But if you have a focus only on cheap and not quality and value, it can really get you into trouble. Here's how the antibiotic market, how we lost that. Our last penicillin fermentation plant. China dumped penicillin raw material on the global market in the mid-2000s. Dumped it means they sold it at a very low price with the intention of driving out US, European, and even Indian producers. And at the end of the day, China became the dominant global supplier of penicillin material, and then they raised the price. So I think the reason that we're not winning on this yet is because China has a strategy, and it knows exactly the pain points of each country and each region. And if they see a move in one direction for an important product, they can say, well, we're going to dump a product, lower the price, and that will deter Western manufacturers from getting back into the game.
Well,
and we don't have a strategy like that.
Let me just qualify this, that the strategy is not just commercial.
This is an industrial strategy by a foreign government to remain dominant in this sector, and as it sees fit, to use that as leverage over any country that it wants to get what it wants.
Well, and it's very interesting that you mentioned quality, of course, because this is the other dimension, right?
Right.
We know all sorts of goods. I had a trip to the Neutramax a production facility. They make some mostly veterinary drugs, but also a few things, supplements, or veterinary supplements, and supplements for humans, a few as well, some very interesting ones. One thing they told me, their chief of quality control told me, is, they would get some large amount of precursor that would arrive, or large amount of component to make the supplement, right? And they said they would notice they had a bar, it said it had to be 95% pure, but something would come and be 94% pure. And what they discovered was that if they ever accepted that 94% pure when 95 was the benchmark, subsequent shipments would be even lower in terms of purity, right? And so they learned they have to ship back that entire ton or whatever large amount was, so that people understood, no, that's our benchmark. And that's astonishing. I mean, that itself was an astonishing realization. So there's just this kind of natural, I guess, incentive to have cheaper products or these components come in, never mind nefarious intent, which is from an enemy country, right?
Well, another prediction in China RX is that the FDA would lose control over its ability to perform its regulatory functions and ensure a safe supply of medicines being sold in America. And that's exactly what's happened. And the pace of that, the decline in what we're seeing in terms of quality has just accelerated. And if we don't fix this now, we're in deep trouble. It was fascinating to hear in March of 2023, the then FDA Commissioner, Dr. Robert Califf, was testifying before House Appropriations. It was budget season for the FDA. So this was the most candid comments from an FDA commissioner that I've ever heard, and I've been following this now for 11 years. He was very concerned about the agency's ability to deal with the Chinese government and its manufacturers. He said the agency had been blocked from traveling to China to conduct on-site inspections of manufacturing facilities. That's a very important part of FDA's regulatory oversight. They check to see if the building really exists, that's where the drugs are being made, that they follow very strict good manufacturing practices. So the agency had been blocked from going. A second concern he raised is the lack of transparency, lack of just being forthcoming. So if you're a manufacturer here in the US, you provide a lot of information to the FDA about your product and your process, your quality control, and that's part of FDA's due diligence. And Dr. Califf said China is just not transparent. And a third point that he raised was something that Congress had done, which was a good thing to do. Congress gave FDA $10 million to conduct what's called unannounced inspections. So imagine you have friends coming over for dinner. And you say, oh, why don't you come over on a Saturday night, next Saturday night. So you probably clean up your house a little bit and, get things in order. That's very different from your friends popping up, ringing the doorbell, say, hey, we're here for dinner. And they get to see what your house is like in real life, day to day. So unannounced inspections are those where, and this happens every day in the United States, the FDA can come to your facility 8:30 in the morning and say, we're here, we're going to be here for a week or two, and we're going to take a really close look and conduct our inspection. And those are very, very rigorous. Unannounced inspections enable you to see in real time what's happening. Those have not happened at all in China, which has refused them.